Hello, everyone. Thank you all for joining us on our latest installment of the Awesome Speakers. I'm Caitlin Watkins, the Executive Director of the Observatory on Social Media. And this is a series of talks that is from some of the brightest researchers and scholars who are working to understand how social media, the internet, and technology impact the world. Please make sure that you check out our website for more information on past and future talks. If you find the topic of this talk interesting, I'm sure you'll be interested in the other speakers we have lined up or have had the pleasure of hosting in the past. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Michelle Amazeen. Dr. Amazeen is the Associate Dean of Research and Associate Professor of Mass Communication in the College of Communication at Boston University and directs the Communication Research Center. Dr. Amazeen examines persuasion and misinformation, exploring the nature and persuasive effects of misinformation and efforts to correct it. She employs a variety of qualitative and quantitative methods to yield results with practical applications for journalists, educators, policymakers, and consumers who strive to foster recognition of and resistance to persuasion and misinformation in the media. Her book, Content Confusion, News Media, Native Advertising, and Policy in an Era of Disinformation, hit the shelves yesterday. So today, Michelle will share insights from her new book and explore some of its key themes. Before we begin, I just want to remind everyone of the typical structure. The presentation will last for about 45 minutes. We'll have time for questions at the end, but feel free to leave questions in the chat or raise your hand if you have a pressing question that you would like to ask. And with that, I will turn it over to Michelle.
Thank you, Caitlin. I'm really appreciative to have this opportunity to chat. And today I'm going to talk to you about some of the research from my new book, Content Confusion. So, as we're all confronted daily by a flood of disinformation, this is content that is intended to mislead us. Some of you may be surprised to learn that it is the mainstream news media that are contributing to this problem. It's not just social media. Not only do digital news outlets disguise paid content to look like news articles, a practice called native advertising, which I'll be talking about today. My research also suggests that this form of advertising influences the real journalism that appears next to it. So today I'm going to talk to you about this media practice, how it affects audiences and the industry, and what the implications are for an accurately informed democracy. My hope is that by better understanding the role of news organizations in perpetuating disinformation, we'll be able to more critically consider the news content that we are consuming. So I'm going to give you a little bit of background about myself. You could see the cover to my book there, and below it is a QR code that will take you to the website for the book. I'm going to talk about some definitions that are used in my research. The definition of native advertising. We'll talk about its effects on audiences, how it's amplified, how it affects the journalism industry, and what this means for democracy. And I'll end with some hopeful solutions, I hope. So my program of research over the years has examined how people recognize and respond to persuasion, mediated persuasion, as well as misinformation, and also different interventions that can help people become more resilient. And again, while many of you frequently examine misinformation circulating on social media, I want to emphasize today that it's not just what's on social media. Some of this originates in mainstream media. So a little bit more about me so you can understand how I got here. So I'm from Chicago. I grew up in the suburbs of Chicago, and I grew up at a time when news was so important. In my family in particular, news was really important. Our family subscribed to two daily newspapers that were thrown on our driveway every day, the Chicago Tribune and the Daily Herald. My family listened to news throughout the day. There was the evening news, the television evening news, the anchors in Chicago that we listened to, Bill Curtis, Walter Jacobson, Carol Marin. Um, and my parents also listened to the nightly news as well. So news was venerated in my household, and I'm a big proponent of journalism. So I wanted to be sure to start with that because I'm going to be critiquing the industry today. And I even wanted to become a journalist at one point. When I was in seventh grade, I tried out for my junior high school newspaper, and at the workshop that we had, my writing was held up by the faculty advisor as not good. It was ridiculed. So that ended my aspirations to be a journalist, but it's okay. I became a professor instead and study journalism and advertising now. So I did my undergraduate schooling at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. I studied advertising. I got a bachelor's degree. I also got a master's degree from there as well in advertising. While I was at Illinois, I worked at the radio station, WPGU Radio, still there today. It's a commercially run radio station, and this had a huge impact on me, and it opened my eyes to the importance of media and how influential media could be. I learned about audience metrics. So that was really formative on me. After graduating with my master's, I went into the industry. I wound up at a subsidiary of Montgomery Ward studying marketing research. I was there for over half a decade. I then moved on to the supplier side. I worked in marketing research at a company called Millward Brown. They were since bought out by Kantar. They dropped the Millward Brown name recently. It's now just Kantar Media. And at some point, I pivoted back to academia, and I got my PhD in mass media and communication from Temple University. And so, with that background, um, as a professor, a couple years ago, I had an assignment for my students where I asked them to write about how young people are consuming news. And so we're living right now in an era of content confusion, which is why I named my book Content Confusion. It's hard to know who's reporting the news that we're consuming. And so this example here brought to the fore what I was writing about. This was in the fall of 2022 when I assigned my students to write about how young people are consuming news. And many of them cited this Wall Street Journal piece. And the citations were a little wonky. One student, their citation to this piece said the author was person. And when I was reading it, I was like, person, that's strange. You know, maybe their last name really is person, but because of that, I further investigated. They did have the hyperlink, and it brought me to this piece here, the Wall Street Journal. Now, if you look closely, when I first looked at it, I thought this was a real news article, but it's not. It is what's called native advertising. If you look closely, there is a disclosure there that says this is content by Deloitte, right? There's also no author byline, as is typical with a journalistic article. And so this is not a journalistic article, this is native advertising. So what is native advertising? It's a type of covert marketing practice where an ad mimics or appears native to the platform in which it appears. And in my book, I focus on how news organizations are using native advertisements. And they're called different things. It's called sponsored content, promoted content, a litany of different names. Um, and that's part of the problem is that there's no standardization as to what this content is called. But I argue that because this content is deliberately misleading and sometimes inaccurate, that this is a form of disinformation. And so let me go back to what the original piece looked like. We just looked at this. And this appears in my book, this screenshot here. If you look closely, there's actually a gray ribbon below the disclosure that says content by Deloitte. And the gray ribbon says the Wall Street Journal news department was not involved in producing the sponsored content. When I was preparing for this presentation today, I went back to the original piece and it looks a little differently now. And I've put it up on the screen here. That gray ribbon with the that says that this wasn't produced by the Wall Street Journal news department is missing. So here's originally there was that gray ribbon with with that disclaimer. It's gone now. All right, this is what it looks like today. It has been replaced with a hyperlink that says learn more. And this is, again, inherent. This is one of the problems with this type of content. It changes over time. It even changes within the same news organization. And it is often made less prominent, as we see here. So we're in an era of content confusion. This is a screen grab from South Park, who's been in the news lately, the satirical comedy show. A decade ago, they did a piece on sponsored content. And what we see here is one of the characters, Steven, who's infamously falling down the rabbit hole of online ads and sponsored content where no one knows what kind of content they are looking at. So this issue has made it into the realm of popular culture. How did we get here? What explains the arrival of native advertising? We can look at this chart to help us decipher this. So this shows revenue, advertising revenue generated by newspapers over the last 75 years. So from 1950, we can see increasing ad revenue, and it hits its apex around the year 2000, and then it just falls off a cliff. And so what happened is the emergence of digital media and the ensuing loss of ad dollars in news outlets. Um, News outlets moved their content online. They didn't put it by and large behind paywalls. And there was a loss of circulation as consumers moved online to get their news. And online advertising does not command the same price point, the same dollar value as in print media. And so there was a loss, a significant loss of ad dollars. And there was also the development of ad blockers online so that people wouldn't have to keep looking at these interruptive pop-up ads and banner ads. And so enter native advertising that can circumvent ad blockers because it's non-interruptive. It looks like regular news content. And so around 2013 or so, after shunning native advertising, which was first started by BuzzFeed and Forbes, but around 2013 or so, the elite news media started to get into native advertising. And the vast majority of them, of the national news outlets, have opened their own in-house custom content studios, such as this one. This is from the New York Times. They have their T-brand studio, which in essence is a mini advertising agency that is within the New York Times. And they partner with corporate clients to create advertisements that mimic articles in the New York Times. The New York Times masthead is on it, and it sounds like New York Times reporting. And so, again, in my book, I'm focusing on this specific type of native advertising, the customized in-house native advertising created by the news publishers' in-house content studios. And so a few more examples. So this one ran in the Boston Globe. Um, we can see there is a disclosure at the top indicating that this is content from Philip Morris International, the tobacco company. So this campaign ran in 2021. It ran in many of the leading news outlets. So the Boston Globe, it also ran in the New York Times, the Washington Post, Reuters. We'll see some more of this campaign in a few minutes. But essentially, what Philip Morris International is doing is trying to explain how misinformation is stifling their tobacco harm reduction efforts. Unbelievably. So they are saying that there's misinformation about their vaping products and ran these in these elite news organizations. So it's tobacco companies, it's the fossil fuel industry. Here's an example of a fossil fuel ad that was created by the New York Times, their T-Brand studio, on behalf of Chevron about global energy consumption. I've circled here the disclosure at the top. It says paid post. It's about politics too. There's Politico has created native advertisements for political candidates. Again, it is disclosed. This was created on behalf of Trump's presidential campaign in 2016 by Politico's in-house content studio, made to mimic their journalism. And it was reportedly one of the Trump campaign's most effective advertisements. There are healthcare companies that are partnering with news organizations to create ads about cancer research. And so this is how disinformation spreads. Legitimate news organizations are appropriated for non-journalistic ends. This example, this is a Sinclair-owned TV station, their website hosting an article on healthcare sponsored by the Huntsman Cancer Institute. We have opioid manufacturers who have run native advertisements. This was an advertorial that was published as a supplement in The Guardian in 2019, telling us that opioids can help us manage our pain. It is disclosed. We can see it's an independent supplement by Media Planet, but it's very prevalent in the news industry today. But as I mentioned, disclosures are required. So in the United States, the Federal Trade Commission requires clear and conspicuous disclosure of advertising content so that it can be discriminated from news. But over and over again, my research, as well as the research of other scholars, has demonstrated that people can't tell the difference. It's intended to mislead people, and it does mislead people. In my studies, typically less than 25% of participants are able to correctly classify this type of content as commercial in nature. They're confused. They think it's journalism. And so just to share a few examples of I how my research addressed this, we studied the disclosures and the types of effects that they had on viewers. So in this experiment here that I'm showing, we manipulated the disclosures. So you're seeing two different conditions here that presumably ran in the Wall Street Journal. It actually didn't. We manipulated the source. We used the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, and Vox. Um, but this was a real native advertisement from Bank of America. It didn't run in the Wall Street Journal though. But anyway, we manipulated the disclosure language, the visual prominence, and whether or not a logo was present. So in these two examples here, the language, the disclosure language says partner content, which I think was moderate explicitness. It's not very explicit. Um, and on the left, it's hard to see the visual prominence. It's small font, it's grayed, it's hard to see. In the example on the right, it's much easier to see the disclosure. It's larger font and it's surrounded by a red box. And so what we found, I guess kind of unsurprisingly, is that when the explicitness of the language is greater, it's easier for people to recognize the content as commercial in nature. Same with the visual prominence. Greater visual prominence leads to more people recognizing the content as commercial, and same with the presence of a logo. So I want to return to the notion here that this is deliberate, what these news organizations are doing in making these native ads hard to distinguish from news. This is famed advertising man David Ogilvy. In his book, Confessions of an Advertising Man, which he wrote in 1963, he started the Ogilvy and Mather advertising empire, which still continues on today. He wrote, "There is no need for advertisements to look like advertisements. If you make them look like editorial pages, you'll attract about 50% more readers. You might think that the public would resent this trick, but there's no evidence to suggest that they do." Well, we have the evidence now, David. I know you're no longer around, but I share in my book how our participants responded when we asked them, what do you think of native advertising? So this data here is from 2017. And okay, most people, they weren't sure how to respond, or their responses were neutral. They said things like, well, I don't have any thoughts about native advertising, or I don't know enough about it, or no thoughts come to mind. But the next largest proportion of respondents responded unfavorably. A third of them responded unfavorably. And what were their thoughts? Well, many of them were concerned with the credibility or trustworthiness of this practice of native advertising. For instance, one person said, "It makes me think the article is biased and therefore it lacks credibility." Someone else said, "Very misleading and bad for a trustworthy news organization." Others were concerned about deception. One person said, "It's a deceitful tactic. Otherwise, I would not entertain a glance at this page." Someone else said, "It's manipulative and dishonest." And then other respondents organically brought up the term fake news on their own. Remember, this is 2017 when fake news was ascendant, the term. So one person said, "This is a terrible way of manipulating the public into believing fake news. The epitome of fake news." Now, there were some respondents who had favorable thoughts towards native advertising, but they were in the minority. Only 8% of our participants came up with thoughts that were favorable, and even some of those were conditional, such as fine, as long as it's stated clearly, or as long as it was marked as advertising, then it's fine. So beyond asking people for their thoughts, I've also done experiments to examine how people perceive and respond to native advertisements. So I'm going to show you a few examples now. This is from a nationally representative population in the US, and the green bars are participants who were exposed to a native advertisement but recognized what it was. They knew that, oh, this isn't journalism. This is a native ad. And then the red bars represent people who were shown the same content but thought it was journalism. And the orange bars represent our control. Those were people who saw a display ad. And what we found over and over again is that the people who recognized they were looking at native advertising, they had statistically less favorable perceptions of the publisher. So their attitudes towards the publisher were significantly lower compared to those who didn't recognize the content as native advertising. And it also hurt the publisher's perceived credibility, how people perceived the credibility of the publisher. And it didn't matter whether the publisher was an elite publisher or legacy publisher or a digital first publisher like Vox or Huffington Post. In both cases, the people who recognized the content as commercial in nature had less favorable perceptions of the publisher compared to those who did not recognize it. And so today, we know that how people are consuming news has changed. Uh, Digital consumption is how most people are getting their news today. It's overtaken TV and radio, much less print. And so I also talk about in the book how digital device type interacts with people's motivation to consume news content. I brought people to my lab in one study and I randomly assigned them to participate in our study, either using a mobile phone that we gave them or a laptop. And what we found is that when they used a mobile device, people had a harder time processing information. And even among those who were most motivated to consume news, they struggled to identify native advertising when using the mobile device as opposed to using a laptop. And so what's happening now is that native advertising is frequently being used by news outlets. And they're also learning how social media can be leveraged to help amplify this native advertising content. And I have an example here that I want to talk about that's in the book. So this is a Facebook post by Sheryl Sandberg. This was in 2020, January of 2020. At that point, she was the chief operating officer of Facebook. And she writes, great Teen Vogue piece about 5 incredible women protecting elections on Facebook. And we can see at the bottom, teenvogue.com, how Facebook is helping ensure the integrity of the 2020 election. And if you remember back to the 2016 election, there was a lot of talk and even some evidence that foreign adversaries manipulated some of the content on Facebook and had an impact on the election. So here is Facebook now telling us that, they're on it for the 2020 election. They're going to make sure that, everything is good. And so Sheryl Sandberg posts this Facebook post. If we look over at Twitter, the same Teen Vogue piece has been shared by a user, and they write, what is this? Teen Vogue? They're tagging Teen Vogue. And the person running the Teen Vogue account writes, literally, I don't know. What? Shouldn't the person from Teen Vogue know what this is? So let's look at how this content appeared on the Teen Vogue website. So this is how it appeared initially, how Facebook is helping ensure the integrity of the 2020 election. After this tweet, something was added to the website. And here it is, an editor's note which I've highlighted in the red box. There was no red box around it. I added the red box. Editor's note. This is sponsored editorial content. Okay, so here's an example where a prominent person from Facebook leads us to believe that what she's sharing is a news article from Teen Vogue. She knew very well that Facebook paid for this content. And there was no disclosure originally on the website. It was added later after the people within Teen Vogue were like, what is this? What is this? And it also, there's no disclosure on the content shared on Facebook. According to the FTC, the disclosures are supposed to travel with the content. No matter where it appears, there is supposed to be a clear and conspicuous disclosure, and it's not there. And so this is something, this is a specific study that I did with Chris Vargo, where we looked at how native advertisements appear on Twitter. And we looked at 5 elite news organizations that were using native advertising. And what we found was that although the disclosures were on the websites of the native advertisements at the news outlets, when people shared it on Twitter, half the time, those disclosures disappeared on Twitter. Others have looked at Facebook and the same thing. Half the time, the disclosures disappeared. So a few more examples. So going back to that Philip Morris campaign that I shared with you previously, as I said, it ran in different outlets. This is what it looked like in the Washington Post. It was created by the WP Creative Group. We can see the disclosure there. It says content from Philip Morris International. It also ran in Reuters, and Reuters also labeled it on their website. So it says paid for and posted by Philip Morris International. They had a second disclosure on it, paid content. But in both cases, when I shared these native ads that looked like articles on social media, no disclosure, right? In the Washington Post, there's no disclosure. It just looks like it's a Washington Post article. Same with Reuters, no disclosure. All right. And so why this is a problem is because we know that the vast majority of people, when they're scrolling on social media and they see something interesting, if they share it, 60% of the time, they've never clicked through to actually read the content, right? So they may be sharing what they think is an article that is, in fact, paid content. This is what it's supposed to look like. This is proper disclosure. This is the example from the New York Times. You can see that the disclosure advertisement in all caps carries through in the Twitter card. And it's also in the auto-filled text at the top as well. So this is what it's supposed to look like. And so a couple more points about sharing this content on social media. In our study, we found that when a disclosure was present, we did a field study actually looking at what people were saying. We found that the organic text that people filled in the tweets, when a disclosure was present, the organic text was more likely to be negatively valenced, but not all the time. So the 2 examples I have here, the one on the right, somebody shared a native ad from Land O'Lakes butter, and they clearly understand that this is sponsored content, right? They write in, okay, this is an ad sponsored by Land O'Lakes, good butter. I still like the story. Okay, that's good. However, the example on the right is more in line with what we more often found. This person is sharing a native ad that ran in the New York Times, and they write, China murders dissidents and innocents or puts them in slave labor camps. The New York Times accepted money from the communist Chinese, not only to run this propaganda, but to make it look like regular news. Blood money. You can almost hear the anger coming out of what they wrote. Okay. And look at how many people engaged with this tweet compared to the positive tweet on the right. And so what we found again is that when a disclosure was present, people responded more negatively. And so what we're seeing is that these disclosures are having an inoculating effect on how people respond to paid content. They're more likely to resist it when a disclosure is present. Nonetheless, there's still more work to do, especially as native advertising is being leveraged by fossil fuel interests, which I have an example here. I'm sharing a native ad that was created by the Washington Post, their content studio, on behalf of the American Petroleum Institute, saying, "Can natural gas be the key to lowering emissions?" No disclosure. Um, so what I haven't yet been able to look at is to what extent are these ads being amplified on social media? How far are they traveling? How far and wide? And which accounts are most influential in amplifying this type of native advertising? And so this is my plea to this community tuning in today. Please do this type of research. Feel free to reach out to me, but we need more people looking at this type of research. So just a couple more examples of how native advertising is being disseminated. What I'm showing here, this is a real news article from the New York Times. If we look over to the right, the sidebar, we can see the editor's picks. This is where the New York Times editors are telling me, here's what we think you might find newsworthy and would like to read next. If you look closely, they're actually serving me a native advertisement as one of their picks. And so what's happening is this commercial content that the New York Times has created is now competing for my attention with their own journalism. And often in these contracts that the news outlets have with their corporate clients, they are contractually required to get a certain amount of engagement with their native advertisements. And so that's why they're promoting it on social media. That's why they're promoting it in their editors' picks. And just one last example here, even on Google, there's undisclosed native advertising that pops up. Um, and I think this is how my students, from the example at the beginning of my talk, the Wall Street Journal, I think this is how they came across it. So you can see in the search box at the top, I typed in young adult news use. And here's what pops up. And you can see where the arrow is. This is the article or native advertisement from the Wall Street Journal, but there's no disclosure. It just looks like it's a Wall Street Journal article and thus explains how my students were deceived. So beyond the disappearing disclosures, I'm also concerned about how native advertising is affecting journalistic integrity. Um, I talk about in the book another study where um, my colleague Chris Fargo and we looked at, again, some of the elite news organizations that have been engaging in native advertising. We looked across time, 5 years, and we looked at Fortune 1000 corporations that they partnered with to create native advertisements. And we looked at whether there was any impact on their journalism after those native advertisements ran. And what we found is that half the time there was an agenda cutting effect, meaning after a native advertisement ran, there was significantly less reporting on that corporate client. So Wells Fargo was one of them, which is the example I have here. And so this brings up, concern. I'm concerned about they're reporting less on these corporations after a native advertisement. And interestingly enough, if there's anyone out there who's a fan of the morning show, as I am, this is a topic in this year's season 4. There's the agenda cutting that they're talking about. They didn't use the words agenda cutting, but there is complaints from an advertiser, a powerful advertiser. It happens to be a fossil fuel company in the show. This fossil fuel company is complaining that they're going to pull their advertising contract because they do not want the anchors talking about climate protests. So life imitates art, imitates life. It's this whole circle. Yeah. So again, this is the study where we actually did the agenda cutting or agenda setting research. So this effect is concerning because we now have commercial content, such as yet another example from a fossil fuel company partnering with an elite news organization, this time the New York Times. You can see it says paid post at the top. This one is from ExxonMobil. And this ad resembles a news article, but it was created by the New York Times and amplified by the New York Times, and it's competing for our attention. And it's also an exhibit in a lawsuit by the Massachusetts Attorney General for being false and misleading and in violation of the Massachusetts Consumer Protection Act. So it was focused on biofuels. This lawsuit was put forth in October 2019, and it stated that Exxon has systematically and intentionally deceived consumers about the central role its fossil fuel products play in causing climate change, in part by talking about things such as biofuels. So, as news organizations have launched their own in-house content studios, they're now creating commercial material for advertisers that may directly contradict the reporting coming out of their newsrooms from their own journalists. And they're also contractually required to promote that content. And this is creating a competing agenda for our attention. And so if news organizations are compromised in these ways by native advertising, how are we as citizens supposed to be accurately informed to make effective policy decisions on consequential issues such as climate change that affects all of us? My concerns are that native advertising deceives audiences, the disclosures disappear half the time, and it's harming journalistic integrity. So in my book, I do offer some solutions. This chart here should come to no surprise to any of you listening. Trust in media is at an all-time low. So what I'm suggesting is that we need regulatory reform, we need structural reform, and there's also educational solutions. So in terms of regulation, we need to standardize the disclosures. As I outline in my book, it used to be that the word advertisement was required. That got softened over the years. We need to go back to standardize disclosures. We could also embed digital watermarks, require that digital watermarks be embedded in native advertisements so that it stays with the content no matter where it goes, on social media, elsewhere on the internet. I also think we need to get better at enforcing the existing regulations that we already have. There's very few examples of the FTC going after people who violate their disclosure rules. I chronicle them in my book. We need more. And then lastly, in terms of regulation, I look to the EU for this. So the EU has its Digital Services Act, which is about platforms, which is different than native advertisements. But the Digital Services Act requires the largest platforms to create a digital repository of the ads that are running on the platforms. I think a similar solution would be useful here. These native advertisements are very hard to keep track of. Uh, there's no standardization in what they're referred to, which makes it hard for academics to study them. And they're hard to find on the news outlets' websites. So I suggest that we need to have a digital repository. I am creating one based upon fossil fuel industry native advertisements. The QR code that you see here is a data donation request. If you in the audience come across a native advertisement and you would like to bring it to my attention, you can fill out this form that's linked to this QR code, and we'll include it in our repository if we don't already have it. And so the hope is to make this repository publicly available in the future, hopefully within the next year, so that academics and others, activists, legal scholars can study this. We also need some reforms, some structural reforms. We need more independent media. And, this is really sad because when I was writing this book, we still had the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. We no longer do. Our public media is under threat. We need to reinforce our commitment to public media. John Oliver this week has a great new episode out about saving our public media. I urge you to look up John Oliver and his Last Week Tonight show. We can also have more nonprofit news designations. And then finally, educationally, media literacy needs to be more central, not only for young people, but for seniors, for new immigrants, to better understand our media, its purpose, the techniques that are used, what's left out of media messages. My research shows that people who have greater expertise in news literacy, they're more likely to be able to identify native advertising, and they're less likely to share it. So, as disinformation spreads throughout media platforms around the globe, not just in the United States, an institution positioned as a bulwark to this threat, the news media, is the bulwark. The news media has been compromised by its embrace of native advertising. Regulations that tinker around the edges to make native advertising less bad, maybe too little, too late. For as I argue in my book, advertisers have now colonized news organizations and are affecting the news agendas that digital news consumers like us are exposed to. Advertisers can now offer an alternate reality on all the news that's fit to publish, one that is not only legitimized by news organizations, but also created by them. If you come away with nothing else from today's talk, I hope you will at least be a little bit more critical of the media content that you're consuming. Thank you so much, and I'm happy to answer questions now.
Thank you so much for that talk. Does anyone have a question that they would like to start us off with?
Should I stop sharing my screen, Caitlin?
Sure. And then people will kind of have their videos and it's a little easier to see them.
Okay, I'll start. Thank you so much, Michelle. Great talk. Really interesting work. And my question to you is like about the disclosures. Like at the end, you said like we need clearer rules, we need better enforcement of the existing rules. So do you think that that would be enough? Like if all if all the issues that you've outlined, cases in which the disclosure is missing, and if it was there, if it was sure that it was included when people share posts on social media, which now is often lost, if it was not you hidden through dark patterns, like you've shown, like like you have to click on something for it to show, which is a well-known dark pattern, a way to hide stuff. So if you think that all these issues were addressed, then would you be okay with native advertisement? Do you think, okay, yeah, it's a reasonable thing to have, it's part of the industry, it's part of the way that we can support journalism, as long as it is not done in a deceptive way? Or is there a deeper concern that you have, like, yeah, that's a patch that maybe we should do, but in the grand scheme of things, it's still harmful in some way, like compared to traditional advertising? What are your views on that bigger picture?
Thank you, Phil, and great question and great to talk with you. I see your name everywhere. Um, it's a good question, and I make very clear in my book that I think native advertising should go away. It's at least in news. It is a harmful practice for all the reasons I outlined. And we know that even with the disclosures, people are confused. So I think it needs to stop. But if news organizations are going to continue with it anyway, then, at least make it less bad, which is what these disclosures do. Um, there has been some research with enhanced disclosures that are easier to see and also explain why news outlets are using this. Consumers respond more favorably to them. They think it's more transparent. Um, but I'm quite clear in the book that I think it's a harmful practice, and I do not think that our news outlets should be engaging in this practice.
Thank you, and good luck with the book.
Thank you. Rasika?
Hi, Michelle. Thank you so much for the talk. It was wonderful and like so eye-opening for me. I'd like to pull on the same thread that like Phil was trying to ask about and that you were talking about in your answer. Um, native advertising is something that news outlets have probably adopted because it's a way of like supporting um, uh, journalism practices and stuff like that. And like even though like currently it's being done deceptively, I wonder if you think that there is a way to maybe like modify this practice to do it in a way that's kind of like beneficial for audiences. I mean, the intent of native advertising is to kind of have content that looks similar to what's already there on the platform, but it's like sponsored by a client that's external to the platform itself. So I'm just wondering, like, maybe if it was made beneficial for audiences, would that be something that you would be in favor of?
Well, I think that it's inherently, at its core, it's made to look like the other content. And when it looks like journalism, it's inherently deceptive. So, no, I mean, I don't think news organizations, I mean, they say it allows us perhaps to do reporting that they would not be able to do otherwise without this funding.
Mhm,
If it's deceiving people into believing that it's something that it's not, which by definition it is, I don't think that news organizations should be engaging in this.
mhm. Yeah, cool. Thank you. Just to follow up with that, like, let's say native advertising like kind of goes away, and like that reduces the ability of these news platforms to actually produce content that is required, um, maybe not required, but like should be consumed by people, like, just like headlining news about, current affairs and politics and stuff like that. What would be other ways in which, um, these news platforms should be trying to figure out how their funding and things should be. I don't know much about the world, which is why I'm
Yeah,
asking
yeah,
the
yeah.
question. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's a great question. I don't have a great answer. Subscriber models. I
Mm,
mean, so many of us have come to just assume that content is free. Well,
mm,
you pay what you get what you pay for, right?
mm,
Um, so, you know, reaching out to your audiences for support, um, doing events. We're
mm,
seeing this in the Boston area where some news outlets are having live events where you can come watch the journalists in action, like interviewing
mhm,
experts or local people about what's going on in their community. And, you charge to
mhm,
attend those events. Um, I guess the events could be sponsored if that's clear. I think that's different than like the written journalism. Um, and then just different. So should news be required to turn a profit is the
mm,
question, right? So it's what we're witnessing is a marketplace failure,
mm,
right? Um, the if it bleeds, it leads axiom. That's the kind of content that people are attracted to, and that gets amplified on social media, which so there's this whole algorithmic amplification that headlines are adjusted to make sure that they'll get amplified on social media. So these nonprofit or low profit designations might be another way
mm,
for news organizations to lower the pressure on
mm.
being profitable. We're seeing some of this, I think, in Philadelphia. There's news organizations that have come together in some sort of collaboration. Uh, yeah, so those are some of the suggestions.
Cool. Thank you so much.
Tae Young.
Hi, it was really fascinating talk. Thank you so much. And I actually urged my students to be here. So it was glad to see some of the students, attended your talk because I'm teaching misinformation literacy with Phil here and the other great faculty member from media school and the Lady School. I'm a student professor in
Wonderful.
media school, by the way.
I'm so glad to hear this because we
Yeah,
need more of that.
this is really amazing talk. And in class, I actually urge my students to detect some native advertising on news websites, just like you did. But I think that's still quite optimistic thing because if someone visited news website and even misled by native advertising, that means that person at least visited news websites. But there's not reality these days, and I think we have seen so many more pessimistic reality, especially because of Google AI summaries. People even don't go
Yeah,
to news websites, no traffic at all, or very reduced traffic from the search engine, right? So I'm curious, is there any possibility or chance for AI to be misled by native advertising so that they can just use native advertising as an information source?
right.
So sometimes they just use news websites or Wikipedia or some other
Yeah,
sources for their information summaries, right? So if there's no lack of disclosure or lack of disclosure standardization, so human beings could be misled, then I think AI could be too. So have you ever taken a look at such possibilities by any chance?
that's a great question. I have not looked at that yet. I've posted on social media a little bit about that because Elon Musk has actually said that his Grok, which is I guess his AI, um, that they're going to have advertisements within Grok or something. But you're absolutely right. If the Google search, I explain in the book that Google has these requirements that are supposed to, behind the scenes, it's supposed to be flagged and identify to web domains that this, do not, no robots or something, and that no follow, that discloses that the content is commercial, that it's advertising. This is at the back end. So it doesn't get ingested into Google searches. But as I showed, that doesn't always work. And so I agree with you, Tae Young. And if if AI models are ingesting all this content and they're ingesting what's on Google, then they're ingesting commercial content without realizing it. So yes, that's a potential hazard. I think that's quite likely, and I think people should be studying this.
All right, we are at time, so we want to thank you once again for an amazing talk. We really appreciated you spending time with us this afternoon to tell us about your book.
Thank you so much for this opportunity.
All right. We'll see everybody at our next talk.
Thank you.
Thank you again.